Hey guys, it's Robin, RsIslandCrafts, and welcome to my craft room. Today, I thought we would make another scrappy project, and we can make one of these little coffee sleeve cozies. I bought my kids these to-go coffee cups when they were in high school. Robbie liked to take hot cocoa or coffee with him in the morning, so it was a great way for him to take a cup to school, and I did not have to worry about him bringing it back home. And of course, there's all of y'all that enjoy the Starbucks and the Dunkin' Donuts coffees, but they tend to get a little hot with the hand. So it's a nice gift to make a little bit of a sleeve for the coffee cup. This way, when you're holding it, you have a little extra protection. You're holding onto this fabric, and it is going to keep your hands from getting too hot, so you can actually drink your coffee if you like to drink it scalding hot when you first get it. The process of making these are really quick and easy. You have your scrap fabrics on the front, or you can use one whole entire piece of fabric, and then I just use a standard piece of fabric on the back. I didn't piece this one, although you could if you wanted to use up more scraps. Now for the inside of my sleeves, I am just using a simple piece of cotton batting. If you're not a quilter or you don't have batting around, you can use fusible fleece. That way it will all stay in place, and if you're worried about anything shifting, it's such a small project, I didn't have any problems with that. You can use a piece of flannel or a piece of fleece, anything that you have around the house. Sometimes if you have a really thin towel or something, you can go ahead and cut that up and put it in there. So this is really kind of anything you want. If you're worried and you want a little extra insulation for keeping your coffee warm and to protect your hand, you can use a product called Insulates, and that insulates your cup and helps to keep the heat on the inside. But I find that this is just enough to hold it to keep my hand from burning while I drink my coffee or hot cocoa or tea or whatever you happen to be drinking. If you have sensitive hands, I know some people have nerve damage and issues with their hands, so you can also use this on a cold drink. They're great gifts for the people that maybe you're friends with the person at Starbucks that you see every day and you want to give them a little gift. This is a nice little gift. So I have my scrap fabrics. I'm going to show you how to make it scrappy like this. And then I'm also going to show you how to make it with just one giant piece of fabric. We're going to go ahead and make this one first. Now I found a pattern for a coffee cozy sleeve online. I'm going to see if I can find a couple more and link them down below for you. This one did not print very well. It kind of overprinted it in a couple different places. So I'm going to see if I can find one that'll print nice and easy and not have any of this extra lines on it for you. You could also purchase patterns. I was given this one, but there are patterns online to purchase if you look up coffee sleeve or coffee cup cozies. Or you can take it the real easy way. You can pop into 7-Eleven or Starbucks and grab one of their sleeves and then just peel it open, and you can use this as your pattern. It's a basic, simple little bit of an arch, so you could also freehand it if you wanted to. So it's easy as just taking it out, and I take it and I traced it out for my batting. So I wanted my batting to be actually the size of the arc in the sleeve. But when I cut my fabric, I just cut a chunk of fabric that is large enough to cover this. You want something that's going to be about 4.5 inches wide and about 12 inches long. It gives yourself a little extra room all around just to have it so when you're doing it, you don't have to worry about anything getting too close to the edges or anything like that. It just gives you that little bit of extra room. Now my scrap here was an actual sort of square rectangle thing. It wasn't quite the size I needed in width, so I went ahead and I put it on the diagonal. I just need to be a little careful because it does make it bias, but it's such a small project that any type of scrap is going to work and you don't really have to worry about it too much. You can even use something like denim or corduroy. You can use flannel and fleece, whatever favorite scraps that you have laying around. I pick up these little ponytail ties at the Dollar Tree. You could pick them up at Walmart or Walgreens or any grocery store or pharmacy. Pick them up online. You can use a standard, just regular piece of elastic if you want. I have this rounded elastic that would work too, but you can also use the flat elastic. If you don't have any elastics and you don't have any buttons to make your closure with, you can also go ahead and use some Velcro. You would just need to put a piece of Velcro on the outside and then one on the inside here just to hold it, just to give it a little bit of an overlap, about 1 inch or so. So I'm going to show you how to make the one with just 2 pieces of fabric and your batting. Now there is a top and bottom to this because of the way the arch here goes. This is going to go around the bottom of your cup. So if you have a directional fabric like these peppers here, you want to make sure that you're going to put your batting and your fabric so that that smaller arch is down on the bottom and it comes across the top like this. Now, as you can see, I've gone ahead and traced and trimmed out my batting so I have an exact template right there. You can go ahead and take your template and trim out all of them. I just like to take a big piece of the chunks of fabric, and instead of tracing around all of it, I just like to take my scissors, and on one of these flat ends, it's going to be where we're going to go ahead and stick one of our hair ties. So I'm just going to go ahead and give this one a trim. Let me put a little pin in it. It saves a little bit of time of going through and trimming every little piece and cutting it all out. When we're using these large pieces of fabric, it's just easy enough to go ahead and do it this way. And the reason I'm going to do that is because I tend to forget on every one I've made when I was practicing this, I always forget to put the elastic in. So if you forget to put the elastic in, you have to go ahead like this one. I made the test one. I forgot to put the elastic in. I went ahead and I stitched all the way around and everything. So for this one, I can choose to either put Velcro on it, or I can go ahead and on one of these sides, I can take out my top stitching and I can unstitch it in here also. But since it's already done to this point and it's all pretty, I'll probably just put Velcro on it. Call it a day. But if you forget as you're turning it around before you get to the top stitching, it's really easy to go ahead and unpick a side to go ahead and stick it back in. I think I'm going to use this simple green one for this. Now these have the metal on it, so for these I'm going to go ahead and trim that metal right off so we don't have to deal with it at all. Just be careful it doesn't go flying across the room. Now you can go ahead and just hold this and put it in there and stitch over it, but if you're struggling a lot, you can either take a piece of thread and wrap it around it and tie it, or I just have some little clear tape here, little Scotch tape. Just go ahead and tape these two together. It doesn't have to be fancy because I will be cutting that off, but it does give me a little bit of a handle. It gets a little twisted sometimes, so if you just kind of untwist it like that, it saves that problem. Now we want this to be on the outside, so when we first start sewing, we need to put it in between our outside fabric and our lining. So I just find about the halfway point, pop it in there. The tape is holding it together, so then when I go ahead and I start stitching, I can go ahead and stitch over this and it'll be no problem. Now if you've made it so you've gone ahead and you've stitched all around it and you prefer to have these pieces all cut out to be exactly the same, I'll show you another little trick that you can use with your hair tie. It'd probably help you not to forget to put it in like I have. You just get this all trimmed up. See, I only had to trace around one, and now I can just go ahead and use this. If the fabric sticks out a little extra, it'll be okay, because I'm going to use the batting as my guide anyway. So on my regular piece of fabric, whether the batting's there or not, I'm going to go ahead and layer this down. Let me just pull it out so we're looking at just our piece of fabric. I'm going to put it down so that my loop is on the inside. It doesn't really matter which side you put it on. If you have a preference, just do it on the same side all the time if you're making multiples of it. I have the tape so it's sticking out. And I'm just going to go ahead and stitch over this just a couple times, about 1/8 of an inch from the edge. It's going to hold it down so I don't have to worry about it moving around anywhere. If you get it about halfway, great. If you're a little bit off, it's still going to be okay. I just wouldn't put it all the way up close to the top or the bottom. You want to be somewhere in this center section. Stitch slowly over it. You could try pinning it if you want. And I'm going to stitch over it a couple times just to hold it in there securely. So if you were using regular elastic, I'd use probably about a 3.5, 4-inch piece. You can always leave the extra sticking out and just trim it off. And then you'd have to go back through and do your layers again. So I want my right sides facing of my lining and my outside fabric. Remember, I chose to use the opposite side, the back side, the wrong side of my bluish purple fabric here. Another good way, I don't have to worry about lining anything up there. It's all going to be fine. You could put this on either side, your batting. Now, if you want, pop a few pins in it to hold it all nice and steady so nothing moves. Just when you're putting your pins in, kind of put them down the center so that they're not where you're going to be sewing. That way you don't have to worry about taking them out as you're stitching. You could also go ahead and put your pin in so that your little hair tie is not going to move. You have enough space. It should not move into your stitching area, but should be fine. So I'm going to go ahead and line my presser foot up on the side of my batting, and I'm going to use that as my guide. I'm going to stitch a 1/4 inch. I'm going to use about a 2.5 stitch length. You can adjust it as however you prefer. I'm going to stitch all around, but I'm going to start and stop here on this bottom inside curve because I want to use this spot for flipping it. Double check to make sure all of my peppers are facing in the right direction. So if you have directional fabric, you want to make sure it's all facing up to the top so that when you're having it around the cup and you're looking at it, everything's going to look all nice. I'm going to backstitch at the beginning and the end of my turning hole just so I don't pop any of my stitches when I flip it. Now when I get over here to where my hair tie is, as I'm stitching this, I'm going to want to back stitch over it a couple times. That's going to be your main stress point as you're pulling this around the button. So you want to give that a little extra stitching just to hold it all in nicely. Just go slow. Your machine, these are really squishy ones, so the machine is really easy to handle it. If you maybe have something different, you might have to go a little bit slower. If you have a hard time backstitching, you can go ahead and just cut your thread and move it back to before the hair tie and just go ahead and stitch it again. So give it about 2 or 3 passes over and then you can continue on. Now if you have any extra fabric here, we're going to go ahead and trim that down so that our seam allowance stays at a 1/4 inch. But since we have curves here, what we're going to want to do is we're going to either want to take our scissors and make little snips almost to the stitching line, but not all the way. If you flip it over, you can see your stitching line really easy this way. So we're just going to go ahead and make little snips into it. But what I like to do is I like to just grab out the pinking shears. So I'm going to take the scissors though, I want to cut off my hair tie, that little extra there, just so I don't have to struggle with the pinking shears to get that cut off. I don't want to trim the seam allowance down here where the turning hole is. I want enough extra fabric to tuck it in so that I don't have any issues. I notice right here that I'm right at the edge almost of the pepper fabric. So if I had gone past it and the pepper fabric didn't get caught in the seam allowance down there, then I can go ahead and just stick this back underneath the machine. I can go ahead and take a little bit of a bigger seam. See how I have that second seam right there? So here's my first one where it could fray, and there's my second one. But with just this little bit, as long as I've caught enough of the fabric, I wouldn't worry about it, because as we flip it out and we go ahead and top stitch, it's going to go ahead and hold everything down. But if you're concerned about it, you can just go ahead and put another line. Just try to follow the curve just a little bit. You don't want to come way up this way or anything. Just give it a little gentle follow. Everything else looks really good. That's another reason why I like to leave extra fabrics, so that I don't have to worry I have all that extra to move along when I'm stitching. So I'm just going to grab my pinking shears and I'm going to trim around it. But before I do that, I'm going to go ahead and take my corners and just trim them down a little bit, just to save on that bulk in the corner. You want to keep about 1/8 of an inch or so from your seam. Once again, if you accidentally cut through it, you can just put it back underneath your sewing machine needle and make a new seam on it and get that all trimmed up. So if you don't have pinking shears, you're going to use your scissors to go along here. I would go ahead and trim this down to a scant 1/4 inch, a little bit of a heavier 1/8 of an inch, just to trim down that seam allowance once again to reduce the bulk. But since I am using pinking shears, that is going to trim it down on its own. Once again, leave the opening alone so that I have enough fabric to turn and I don't have to worry about anything peeking out in a weird way. I'm going to go ahead and pink the edges anyways, just to trim down that extra seam, even though it doesn't need it. I'm trimming from the fabric side just because it's easier to see the stitch line since I used a white thread while sewing this. Now you can use hemostats if you want to go ahead and turn these right sides out, but it's small enough and the hole's large enough that I can just stick my fingers in it. You want to put your fingers between your regular fabric, your outside fabric, and your lining fabric. If you go between your batting and your fabric, you're going to have the batting and the wrong side of your lining showing. So go between your two main pieces of fabric. I go ahead and grab it from the long side first, just because that seems to be easier. And then I just push through the hole. That's why we backstitched when we did our first line of stitching against the hole here, so that we don't pull out our threads. I have a crochet hook. This is a plastic one. It has a point, but it's kind of dull. So this is really good for pushing out corners. They have special tools for it. You can use a pencil, like a wooden pencil, just break the tip off so it's not too sharp. You can use a like a clicker pen that doesn't have any ink in it anymore, although you would be getting the ink on the inside, so it wouldn't be too bad. I just give a little tug on my elastic just to get these corners out. So now I'm going to take this over to my iron and I'm going to give it a nice press and a good steam. I'm just going to fold in my edges on the hole there so they line up nicely. So I have that nice smooth continuation there and I don't have any weird jagged parts coming out. I try to stay away from the elastic and I just kind of press this end, maybe hit the corners a little. I don't know how much damage. I know heat and elastic don't go good together, so I don't want to cause any problems when I got to this point already, so I don't want to have to start all over. I think our peppers are looking really good. I'm going to go ahead and stick with my white thread across the top, because if I'm going to do multiple of these, I'm just going to kind of use a regular one. You can use any type of a neutral thread. I think it's perfectly fine to see the outline along that. If you're only making one, you can go ahead and change it to a red or a green. If you're a new sewer, if you match your thread to whatever you're stitching, if you get a little off on your stitching, it won't be as noticeable. But since I have red and green going all over, I think it's going to be fine to just use a white. I used a gray on this one with all of these colors, and it's fine. I tend not to, when I'm doing production line sewing and I want to make a bunch of them, I tend not to want to change out my thread on each and every one of them. And also by using white, this will allow you guys to see the stitching. So here's my turning hole. I want to start at this end of it just before it. That way I know I've caught it evenly. I'm going to use a top stitching, which is about 1/8 of an inch away from the edge. When I first start out, I like to go ahead and I hold my top thread, I put my needle position down and back up, and that's going to bring up that bobbin thread. For me, sometimes, most times, if I don't bring up that thread, the bobbin thread tends to get tangled on the bottom with the stitches, and you get what they call a bird's nest, which is a big pile of thread down there, and it just doesn't look as nice. Trim my threads before I get there so I don't make a mess. You can use the same stitch length that you've been using for the whole process, it's going to be fine. You can go ahead and lengthen it a little, shorten it a little. You can use fancy stitches around here if you want. I just go slow in the corners. I have my machine set up so that the needle stays down when I let go of the presser foot. Not all machines have it. So when you get to the corner, if you don't have an automatic needle down, just find your spot to where you're going to make the pivot, and then just take the little wheel on the side of your machine and crank it down to where your needle stays down. That way when you lift up your presser foot and you pivot it, your fabric is not moving all over. You don't get a weird stitch or anything like that, and it's going to be a seamless continuation. Now I'm just going to stitch right over the hair tie still. It's going to give it an extra little bit of strength to hold it in. And when I get to the end and I meet up with the original spot where I started, I'm just going to go ahead and give a little back stitch to lock everything in. I would imagine that there's a good possibility these coffee cozies are going to get coffee on them or hot chocolate, so they need to be at least able to hand wash them. There we go. We have remembered to put our loop in. Everything is facing the right direction. It looks good from both sides. Now we need to figure out how to put our button in. I'm going to choose a black button this time. You can put anything you want on. I happen to have flat buttons. You want to go with something that's a little bit larger, because if you put a small one on like this, it's going to be really difficult for your elastic to go around and stay on. So you want to make sure whatever button you choose is going to work with your elastic. So I'd say about a 3/8 or a 1/2 inch at the least. Small, you know, you want to be at least bigger than that. Now, normally when I'm sewing buttons onto things like for shirts and jeans and such, as I'm stitching them on, I put a toothpick underneath it. That gives it enough room underneath the button so that it's not snug down super, super tight. That way, when you go ahead and put this on, it's going to have room underneath it. You can go ahead and do it with this project if you're a really tight stitcher, but I find when I'm doing these that it tends to have enough give and it's loose enough to go around it. I have stitched this one on just using plain white sewing thread. This one I'm going to go ahead and stitch on using some embroidery floss, just like I did for this one. That just gives it a little bit of an extra fuzz there on it. I don't know, sometimes I like that. You can always trim it down. You can put your knot so that it's hidden underneath the button. I will show you how to do that on this one. But for this one, I just went ahead and I started at the top, and I went through it and I just tied a series of knots. I did the surgeon's knot where you go around it once like you tie your shoes, and then you go around it twice and pull it nice and tight, and then you do another knot, and then you just trim it off and you have it like that. I find that the embroidery floss, using it at 3 lengths, 3 of the individual flosses, works really good. You can use a sewing thread, that works perfectly fine too. You might want to double it up. There is something called a button thread that is nice and sturdy for using on buttons. So what we need to do is we need to decide on where we are going to put the placement of our button. So what I do is I match up, just kind of push it over to the side this way so I have enough room. I match up these 2 short ends here, kind of hold it with my finger, and I want to take this elastic, and I don't want to stretch it like crazy, but I want to give it a little bit of a stretch so that I know my sleeve is going to stay on tight. Kind of put it in the center, and I just have a little Sharpie here. I'm only going to make a little dot, so that's going to be covered by the button, just enough so that I can see where it's going to go and I know where to put my button. Now I am using gray, is going to show up on the back. If you're concerned about having any bit of thread like this showing up, then you're going to want to use a thread that matches. I want you to be able to see it, so I'm going to go ahead and leave it like this. Okay, there's my little spot. I'll even show you with the toothpick so that you can see the whole process this way. I'll put a knot at the end of, let's actually go all the way and we'll use sewing thread. I'm going to put a knot at the end of my sewing thread, just so that it stays. And when I do it, I want to have my knot up here. You can do like they do in quilting, and you could put it in here. You start out, let me move my buttons. If you start out a little bit further, an inch or so away from where you want to come out, and you want to bring your needle between the batting and the top fabric, and you just come out where you put your little hole, your little marker, and then as you pull this, when you pull the thread, when your knot's going to stop right there in the thread. If you give it a little bit of a tug, it'll pop into the fabric. You'll hear it go pop. Now that knot is going to stop at that other piece. It's stuck now between your batting and your fabric, so you don't have to worry about it coming out. That way you don't have the knot there. And if you want, you can just go ahead and do a little stitch through here. Just one quick little stitch and your knot will be underneath your button. So I'm going to put my toothpick so that I can do the hole on either side of it. As I said, that's just going to keep me from cranking down really tight and having it so tight that I can't get the loop around the button. It can be a bit fiddly. I tend to hold it in my lap so that I can hold it like this and be up and close to it and see what I'm doing, but I want you guys to be able to see what I'm doing. And then you're just going to stitch through. Try to keep your threads all about in the same spot on the back. So you're just going to stitch through 3, maybe 4 times. Depends. If you have the button thread, you can go ahead and just do it twice. If you're using the embroidery floss and you're using like 2 or 3 strands, you can just do it a couple times. It can be a little difficult to find the hole. You can just peek underneath. So after I've gone through my holes a couple times, if you have 4 holes, go ahead and do your X. I'm going to go ahead and go through, I'm going to take my toothpick out, and I'm going to pop my needle up underneath the button here. So I'm not going through any of the holes, so I'm between the button and the fabric. And then I'm just going to wrap this around a few times. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is good. That's going to hold the thread underneath there nice and tight and make sure that there's definitely going to be space in between. So the toothpick's going to hold it up off the fabric, so it's going to have a little bit of a loosey-goosey on your thread. So if you wrap it around like that, and then when you wrap again, I'm holding the little loop out here. I've wrapped my thread around the button, and I'm just going to take it through that loop. And that's going to tighten it down there. Now I just fold everything back and just through the batting and the top layer, or just the top layer. Make sure I didn't go all the way through. I picked it, I went through that fabric just a little bit, and I'm just going to head and knot it off. Pull it nice and tight. I'm going to go back through like we did in the beginning, just through the top layer. And make sure I'm not going through the back. I'm just going to slide my needle down a little bit so it comes out a little bit further. That way I can pull my thread. It's going to have a nice long tail, and I don't have to worry about it being too short and the knot coming undone. Give it a little tug, and then just trip it. And then when you go like this, the thread just disappears. So it's very similar. If you're a quilter, you already know that process of doing that. And there we have that. So when we go and we put it on our coffee, obviously you're not going to be laying it down like this. You just slip it through and it goes right over there nicely. Now this is going to fit a variety of sizes. You can always, if it's a little crooked, you can adjust it in the back. You can use a fancy shank button. Just make sure you do it on really tight. I would stitch it on several times because those buttons are the ones that have that little, well, a shank on the back of it so they don't lay flat onto the fabric. I prefer a simple button like this because the shank button will stick out more. I can put my hand on this button and it doesn't bother it, but if it's sticking out too far, you're gonna feel it and it might be wobbly, but it'll work still if you have one, like if you had a chili pepper that you'd wanna use on something like this. So that is just the simplest version of making this with 2 fabrics. Now let me show you how to do it with using your scraps. We're not going to go through the whole process because you've seen it, how to put them together. You have 2 options with your scraps. You can do quilt as you go, or you can go ahead and stitch it all together into one piece of fabric. So I have a bunch of batik scraps here. Now these scraps can be any size you want, but I cut them, since our basic area when we cut our fabric, we needed it to be 4.5 by 12. I went ahead and used 4.5-inch strips. I want to make sure that they're going to be wider than my coffee cozy here, my base batting fabric. If you're cutting them at 1.5 by 4.5, then you want to go ahead and cut about 12 of them. You can cut an extra 1 or 2 for a variety if you want to change them up. You need to just make sure that you cut enough to cover everything up. Some of these are 1.5 inches and some of them are narrower. Like this one here is narrower. You can use any ones you want. So if you have that, I would figure out how many I need to go on there. Then I would just take these to my sewing machine, and with a 1/4-inch seam, right sides together. If some of them are a little longer, I would just make one edge so that they all stitch together. They line up nicely. Now I would stitch these in groups of 2. That kind of helps keep everything lined up so you don't get too wavy on it. Then after you stitch them all in groups of 2, go ahead and cut them. You can take them over and press them open now if you want, or you can wait. And then you're just going to take these 2s and stitch them again together. And you're going to keep following that process until you have them all stitched together in one long row. That's going to be long enough to cover your batting. Then after you have your 4s, just go ahead and continue. If you had to use an odd number because you didn't use them all at the same width, then just go ahead and keep doing them in any groups in whatever configuration until you get them all done. Now I'm just going to take this to my ironing board and I'm going to put it right sides down. I'm going to put my iron here and I'm going to hold this side, and I'm just going to go ahead and iron them all down. You can iron them open, you can iron them flat. You can just let them go however they want, each other way. I'm just going to go ahead and let them go ahead and lay it all one way. Now I can go ahead and take my pattern and lay it down on it and trace it out. If you have, so some of yours were thinner or thicker, you might end up with some with just a little piece of fabric that's going to be sticking there. That's okay. If you want to avoid that little bit like that, just make sure your pieces on either end is wider than the others so that it would go ahead and cover it. I think mine are going to be fine. I have enough on either side here. So then I just go ahead and go through the same process as we did before. I could trace around this. Make sure I put my little hair tie in and do the whole process. But I want to show you how to do it as quilt as you go also. I have my batting. I don't have any backing or anything like that. You can stitch it right to your backing. You would see all the stitching line back here. So if you want it to be nice and smooth, this one I did as a quilt as you go. As you see, there is loose threads, but there is no stitching on the back. It's a nice smooth look. If it matters to you, and if it doesn't, go ahead and put your backing fabric underneath there and stitch it that way. Now you can lay all your pieces out ahead of time and decide what order you want them in so you don't have like 2 of the same color next to it. I'm going to do the plop it to the side and just grab it as you go. I did start in the center and I worked my way outwards either way. So I start with the 1. And I'm just gonna lay them down so they're mostly straight. I'm not following the curve or anything like that. I made sure that I had enough fabric on either side. I didn't fold it in half to get it exactly in the middle. It's not gonna really matter unless you have a specific fabric you want directly in the middle. And then I would just go ahead and stitch it down. I'm going to stick with the 1/4-inch seam allowance like I do with any other quilt as you go. You could take this over to your iron, or you can just go ahead and finger press it. If you have polyester batting or something that can't have the heat directly onto it, you want to put a pressing cloth on it first, but I just go ahead and finger press it like that. I find my next one if I want to alternate dark and light, light and dark. Remember, batiks are the same on either side, but I would be going right sides together. So this one is right side up. So you would have, as you can see, I started with the pink one, so I had the right side up. And then when I did the blue one, I folded it over so right sides are together. It's a little harder to see with the batiks. so that when you open it up, you have the pretty side facing on both of them. I follow that all the way through. I put right sides together, making sure I have enough fabric that's overlapping on each edge of the batting. Now, as you can see on this one, I did end up with little pieces still. It's just something that's going to happen unless you have the big pieces. I didn't go ahead and cut any larger ones like that. I didn't mind having those. You're gonna kind of make it curvy anyway. It's an automatic. The way you're doing this is sewing it down. Just keep adding my next pieces and I'll just follow through. Now I'm going to do the same thing and I'm just going to work it in this direction. You know you're doing a 12-inch strip, so wherever you want to get it and however many colors you want to do, if you want to do it specifically like the rainbow or something, then just go ahead and divide however many pieces of colors you're going to use, divide it by 12 so that you know. So like if you're doing the school colors and you're doing red and white and you want to have it even so it starts with red and ends with white, go ahead and just divide it all out. It's not that big of a project. It's easy to do. I'm going to give it a good steam press. So then when I go ahead and trim it, I will have this piece looking like this and this piece looking like that. So I will have the little bits of like triangles there. So if that's something that you don't like the look of, either use the one straight fabric. Once again, this is quilt as you go, so when you flip it and sew it and everything, it will look like that. So if you just use your one straight piece of fabric, you can go ahead and move your batting around and adjust it to where you want it so that everything lines up neatly. I can take it and line it up so I go 1/4 of an inch or 1/8 of an inch from each seam. Make sure I have enough up at the top, and that way everything will come out nice. You're still, because it's a curve, you're still going to end up with these little triangle pieces. So I don't really think there's too much of avoiding it, unless that last piece is one large piece so that you don't get the little triangles. So I think no matter which way you choose it, you're going to, because you're working on a curve, you can adjust it a little bit if it bothers you, but I think that these come out perfectly fine. I really like the way they look. This one has a little bit over here and a little bit on the top, but they turn out really sweet. So whether you use one fabric, you do quilt as you go, or you make a strip, the process is basically all the same once you get your 2 pieces of fabric. Use a button or Velcro, and you're off to go. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I showed you another way to use up some of your scraps, your scrap fabric, your scrap batting. You could piece the batting if you needed to. It's a small enough piece, it really wouldn't matter. Something great for coworkers, for friends and family. Something good for the craft fair. So as always, I say create with Scraptitude, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.